The Kawa River Model. This model was developed in the 1990s by Japanese occupational therapists. Notably, Dr. Michael Iwama was a main contributor to this model, and he actually wrote the book where the chapter we read came from. This model was developed in response to the need for culturally and socially applicable models that were sensitive to diverse backgrounds. This model has helped to recognize cultural diversity and how we can implement or adapt different models to remain inclusive in regards to clients' different belief systems. This model can be adapted to fit within other cultures and contexts. I think it's important to understand the basics of Japanese culture in order to be able to understand this model. So, Japanese people see the person as inseparable from nature. They believe in an energetic life flow that flows through nature and through people. It's known as chi. Even though chi isn't really mentioned in this model, I can see how this model was inspired by this belief. Japanese culture works from a holistic perspective and uses nature, metaphors, and symbolism to represent one's being. The goal really in this culture is to live in balance with oneself and of nature, and just really not seeing oneself as separate from nature. So Japanese people will really take elements of nature and apply these elements into their own self and even their own bodies to understand somebody's health and well-being. So in Japan, Kawa means river. The river in this model is used as a metaphor to represent one's life. Like I had mentioned before, it's important to recognize Eastern traditions and thought patterns in order to understand the symbolism and importance of this model. The beginning of life is represented at the start of the river, and the end of the river symbolizes death. The river and its elements are seen as one inseparable whole, and each part of the river kind of determines the shape and flow of one's life. Life flow. The goal of this model is to increase one's life flow by working around obstacles. A weakened flow symbolizes stagnance and imbalance, while a stronger flow in the water symbolizes health and well-being. No flow actually symbolizes death. Occupational therapists are seen as people who can help to enhance one's life flow, as occupation is seen as life flow. The focal point for intervention for an occupational therapist really focuses on where the water flow can be increased and how each part of the river is examined to determine where this flow can increase. The Kawa theoretical base. The Kawa model sees the person and environment as one whole. It does not differentiate by seeing factors as separate entities. Factors of this model blend to create the self. The self is seen as an important part of the whole, but it is not inseparable from the whole. Each factor or element affects the whole. The four basic factors include the environment, life circumstances, personal assets and liabilities, as well as life flow and health. I think it's interesting to note that this model can be used as a model of practice, frame of reference, assessment tool, or modality. The elements of the river that we are going to look at and that are looked at in this model is Mizu, which means water, Kawa no Sakuhaki, which means riversides, Kawa no Zoku, which means river bottom, Iwa, which means rocks, Ryubuku, which means driftwood, and Sokima, which is the space between the obstacles where life flows. This is just a picture to show you a visual representation of the elements of the river. You can see that driftwood represents assets and liabilities. Water represents the life flow. Rocks represent obstacles. And the river walls and bottoms represent the social and physical environment. Mizu means water, and it represents one's life energy or life flow. Water is seen as fluid and changeable and dynamic in its ability to change its surroundings. One's life and functioning is affected by how fast or slow the water is able to flow. One's well-being is directly connected to this life flow. And I think a good Western connection here to make as we live in the Western part of the world and we're used to this kind of our own thoughts, is that water can be seen as the supporter of life and one of the basic human needs for life. I think it's interesting that water here is also seen that it can wear against rocks. This force can cause things to shift in the river. It can make driftwood flow. So it's really interesting just to see how dynamic each part of the Kawa model is and what it actually does in somebody's life. Kawa no Sakuhaki and Kawa no Zoku are the river walls and the river bottoms. They represent one's environment on a social and physical level, which affects one's life experiences. So the self and the physical environment really are not seen as two separate things here. It can represent meaningful relationships, family members, and the environment in which one lives. And it helps to define the meaning of occupations, because without our environment, we kind of lose that meaning. Iwa means rock in Japanese. The rocks represent obstacles in one's own life that can include a disability, illness, neurological dysfunction, really anything that serves as a challenge. The symbolism of the rock helps therapists to identify possible areas for intervention and how these obstacles affect that person's participation in their environment. I think what's interesting to note here is that driftwood has the ability to, again, move the rocks. And we're actually going to review what driftwood is in the next slide. Sokima is the space between obstacles where the water or life energy flows. This space is where occupation is represented and can be defined. This is the area where clients and therapists can work to determine what interventions may be helpful in treatment. This space allows for opportunities for positive change to be implemented. The goal of the occupational therapist is to really increase this water flow. The river as one. So the river acts as a whole, where each part can impact the flow of the river, and the elements or parts can affect each other. Like we talked about, the driftwood can either be a hindrance or it can help to move obstacles. The flow of the water can move rocks or obstacles and create new paths. The rocks or obstacles can negatively affect the flow of water. And like we talked about, the driftwood, which is the assets and liabilities, they can wear down rocks or obstacles and move them, or can act as obstacles themselves when they serve as a liability. And the space between all of the elements is where the life flows, the water flows. So let's just tie this all together. Occupational therapists can use the Kawa River model as a holistic and creative way of looking at the entire person. This helps to determine a person's well-being by using a metaphor and symbolism as means to represent one's life, environment, assets and liabilities, as well as life flow and health. Occupational therapists can determine where intervention is necessary by observing what serves as an obstacle, what reduces the quality of life and ability to engage in meaningful occupations. So I just wanted to take a minute to look at the article that I assigned that took place in Limerick, Ireland, and it actually was 2 occupational therapy students working one-on-one with 2 clients who were diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So 2 challenges that came about in this study was that the students weren't really sure like what kind of leadership direction to take when facilitating the drawing of the river, and also the clients expressed a little apprehension in their skills to draw and create this river and represent the different elements. Although the end result was that the Kawa model was very helpful in defining a person's occupations, as well as what kind of intervention was necessary to help each individual increase their ability to participate in meaningful occupations. So I really think it's important for us to do a little bit of applied learning with this model. And I just wanted to show you guys what I did here. I drew my life as a river, and the riverbanks as my social and physical environments include my family, my children, my married life, and the farm that my son goes to and where I volunteer in school kind of like makes up that environment right now, which obviously is kind of like, it always changes for us, the dynamics of that. One of the rocks that I drew was time management, but the one that I'm going to focus on is my stepson Tyler and his recent illness. And so I know that you guys already know the story, and I'm just going to recap it a little bit. So in March, my stepson Tyler was diagnosed with transverse myelitis, and for 3 days we did not have a diagnosis. And this little piece of driftwood here kind of symbolizes my investigative qualities of like always wanting to know the how and the why and really be able to work things out and fix them. So this piece of driftwood in the beginning, where we didn't know his diagnosis, really acted as a liability for me because there were no answers and I couldn't find a solution, and I felt very stuck, and anxious because I like to fix things and figure them out. And that obviously also had an effect on my environment. When I was feeling that way, it affected my children, it affected my family. So as time went on, we finally got his diagnosis, and instead of working as a liability, these investigative qualities that I have really worked as an asset. So I was able to apply those qualities of myself to really understand and learn about what it was that Tyler was going through, what his recovery would look like, do that research, but also be an advocate for him in his road to recovery. So I was able to find the best possible solution and do all of the footwork really for him to go to a rehab in Boston. And that really helped him in his recovery because he was able to go to this top rehab facility that is funded by Harvard University, and that made such a big improvement on where he is at today in terms of his physical disabilities and everything else. So that is just one example of how this piece of driftwood was kind of in play in both a positive and a negative way, and how a rock or an obstacle can affect the whole well-being of somebody's life. These are just my references that I use, which was the book that I was able to find and photocopy for you guys, and also the article that I found that I thought would be helpful to be able to see this model in action.